On the morning of August 28, 1986, in Republic County, Kansas, Evelyn Carter stood at the edge of an 82-acre cornfield when a violent crash tore through the quiet air. The steel fence along the north side collapsed, and 50 Black Angus bulls weighing nearly 1,500 pounds each charged into the field like an unstoppable black flood. Within minutes, thousands of corn plants in the grain-filling stage were crushed under heavy hooves. Many rows were trampled so deeply that the soil flung roots onto the surface. Broken stalks piled on top of one another, forming long trails as if a storm had just swept across the entire field. Every time the herd wheeled around it erased another portion of nearly 6 months of labor. For any farmer, that sight was enough to lose an entire year's livelihood. Across the fence, Calvin Walker leaned against a brand-new Dodge Ram pickup, calmly watching it all. He did not call the cattleman. He did not order the gate closed. He even raised his coffee cup for a sip before breaking into a satisfied smile. Calvin knew exactly when the fence had been opened. He also knew that if the herd stayed a few more minutes, Evelyn would lose almost her entire harvest. For months, Calvin had repeatedly offered to buy the farm at a low price. Every time Evelyn refused. That morning he believed she would have no other choice. Evelyn quietly removed her worn work gloves, folded them, and slipped them into the back pocket of her faded denim overalls. Her eyes did not linger on the ruined field, but fixed on the 1959 Farmall 560, parked beside the red barn weathered by the years. It was not the most powerful tractor in the area, nor was it the handsomest. But for years, no one had ever seen Samuel Carter replace it with another machine, though he could easily have done so. After Samuel died, many people offered to buy the Farmall for more than it was worth. Evelyn refused every time without explanation. Folks around the county only whispered that Samuel had told his wife one sentence before he passed. If a day comes when everything seems lost, let the Farmall lead the way. No one knew what he meant. Even Calvin always figured it was just a story old-timers like to tell to hang on to old things. Let me tell you about Evelyn Carter. That summer she was 74. Her husband, Samuel, had died in 1981, leaving her the farm that had belonged to the Carter family for more than 40 years. Their only son had moved to Colorado but still returned every fall to help his mother with the harvest. Evelyn had never been known for raising her voice. People around Belleville remembered her for one short phrase whenever someone rushed to a conclusion: wait for the land to answer. At 41, Calvin Walker represented the new generation of wealthy Kansas farm owners. He held nearly 4,000 acres, rows of modern machinery, and believed money always beat experience. That morning, watching Evelyn's cornfield trampled under 50 bulls, Calvin was certain he had won. He had no idea that the decision to smile and stand still for those few minutes would become the costliest mistake of his life. 3 weeks before that chaotic morning, the meeting room of the Republic County Agricultural Cooperative was packed with farmers discussing the harvest season. When the talk turned to land deals, Evelyn Carter's name came up again. Her 82-acre farm sat right between two parcels Calvin Walker had bought in consecutive years. With that piece, he could link his entire livestock operation into one continuous stretch, saving dozens of miles of cattle hauling and boosting the farm's value by millions of dollars. For that goal, he had pressured Evelyn for 3 years to sell. When she refused, Calvin began spreading word that she was drowning in debt and only months from bankruptcy. He also quietly convinced the local bank that continuing to lend to a 70-something widow was too great a risk. Evelyn's loan for irrigation repairs was finally denied, not because she could not repay it, but because the bank believed she would soon sell the farm. Evelyn sat alone in the back row of the meeting room. The seat beside her had remained empty since her husband, Samuel Carter, died in the fall of 1981. Their only son had repeatedly wanted to bring her to Colorado to live with the family, but Evelyn always refused. To keep the land she had sold the pickup Samuel loved, mortgaged nearly the entire farm to pay debts after 3 seasons of low grain prices, and done the work of 2 people by herself. Many neighbors thought she was too stubborn. Evelyn only believed some pieces of land cannot be priced in money. Samuel left little besides the farm and the things he taught his wife. One sentence he always repeated each grazing season: never try to beat cattle with strength. Let them think it's their own choice. Evelyn never forgot that advice. She also never replaced the 1959 Farmall 560 Samuel left her, no matter how many people urged her to switch to a new tractor. At that meeting, when someone mentioned the old Farmall, Calvin laughed. That thing belongs in a museum. The whole room laughed with him. Evelyn answered calmly. As long as the work gets done, the field doesn't care what color the tractor is painted. Calvin only shook his head. He believed the experience of old people could never beat money and technology. 3 weeks later, the narrator brings us back to the cornfield being trampled by 50 bulls. While the whole herd panicked through the north corner of the field, one bull suddenly butted an old rotten wooden post, pulling the soil beneath it down and exposing a rectangular metal plate covered in mud, on which the markings Samuel had carved by hand years earlier were still clear. The moment Evelyn saw it, she froze. She understood at once why Samuel had never agreed to sell this land. And if Calvin Walker had seen that plate first, he would never have let 50 bulls into the field that day. By then, Calvin Walker realized the situation was far more serious than he had thought. The 50 bulls were no longer just destroying the cornfield. They began splitting into smaller groups, running in different directions. If even one group reached the federal highway less than a mile away, a fatal accident was almost certain. Calvin immediately jumped into the pickup and shouted orders to the hands. 2 of you to the east. Cut them off. Don't let any of them out the gate. Engine noise roared across the field. 2 ATVs tore through the trampled corn rows. Another pickup circled toward the main road. The cattlemen kept swinging ropes, yelling, and throwing lariats, trying to separate the herd from the field. But the more noise there was, the more the cattle panicked. One bull suddenly wheeled and knocked over a fence post. 3 others charged after it. Within seconds, the whole herd changed direction again. The remaining corn stalks continued to be crushed under hundreds of hooves. Calvin clenched his teeth. This was no longer about one crop. If he lost a breeding herd worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, the damage would far exceed Evelyn's cornfield. He kept pushing the hands to go faster. Horns, engines, people shouting. Every sound made the cattle run harder. A group of about 12 began heading toward the road that led to the highway. The Republic County Sheriff's car sounded its siren in the distance. Right behind it came the volunteer fire department's pickup. News spread fast. Farmers from neighboring places arrived, one after another. Everyone thought more people would be enough to control the herd. Only one person did not do that. Evelyn Carter started the Farmall 560. The old diesel engine rumbled slowly. No loud roar. No throttle. Just steady as a clock. The tractor rolled gradually along the south edge of the field. She did not look at Calvin. She did not look at the people running in chaos. Evelyn's eyes only followed every small movement of the herd. The narrator pauses a beat, then remembers Samuel Carter. Samuel never taught how to chase cattle. He taught how to watch them. He often took Evelyn out to the field at sunrise, not to fix fence, not to feed, but a look. He pointed to flattened clumps of grass, fresh hoof prints, the wind shifting after each tree line, the almost imperceptible slope of the ground. He once said, "People always think they're leading the herd. Actually, it's the land that leads the way." Samuel knew where the cooler breeze came, where the soil was soft, where the shade was, where the cattle always went when they felt threatened. He never wrote those things on a map. He wrote them in memory and passed them to Evelyn. The Farmall kept rolling slowly. Its wheels never crushed the remaining corn rows. It only hugged the edge of the field as if Evelyn were measuring the whole place again. Calvin saw her. He grew angry. "What the hell are you doing? The cattle are about to hit the highway." Evelyn did not answer. She only turned the steering wheel a little, adjusted the Farmall's direction a few more yards. A silver-haired man in the crowd let out a soft sigh. That was Hank Porter, 83. He had worked with Samuel nearly 20 years. Hank looked at the Farmall, then at the wind direction. He looked at the shadow of the cottonwoods to the west. Finally, he turned to the sheriff. "If anyone keeps chasing them, it'll all go wrong." The sheriff frowned. "Wrong how?" Hank only shook his head. "I don't know how much she still remembers, but Samuel sure taught her." No one in the crowd understood what he meant. In their eyes, Evelyn was just an old widow driving an ancient tractor around the edge of the field while the whole place was being destroyed. Calvin grew more impatient. He jumped down, snatched a rope from a hand, and ran toward the herd himself. His shouting carried across the field. The cattle jerked. A cloud of dust rose. But right then, the first strange thing happened. The lead bull, the biggest and meanest in the herd, suddenly slowed. It raised its head, both ears pricked straight. Its nose drew hard at the air. Then it slowly turned toward the narrow grass corridor on the west side of the field, a place almost no one had noticed for years. The lead bull stood still for only a few seconds. It no longer looked at the people yelling behind it, but fixed its eyes on the narrow strip of grass running along the west edge of the field. The whole herd slowed with it. That was the first moment since the fence collapsed that the sound of hooves was no longer like thunder, but began to thin. Calvin Walker did not notice. He kept shouting. One hand started an ATV to cut off the lead bull when Hank Porter stepped up, grabbed the handlebars, and shut it off. Don't. Calvin spun around. Are you crazy? Hank only looked toward Evelyn. If you want to save the herd, let her do it. Calvin started to argue but stopped. For the first time, he looked carefully at the direction Evelyn was moving. The Farmall 560 kept rolling steadily along the edge of the field, not fast, not slow. The sound of the old engine was strangely steady. No throttle roar, no sharp turns. The tractor never closed in on the cattle. It only held a constant distance, close enough for the herd to know there was an obstacle, far enough that they did not feel hunted. At that point, the narrator reveals what Samuel had taught Evelyn over many years. Samuel never believed a person could control a panicked herd of cattle. He believed you could only adjust the environment so the cattle made the right decision themselves. The Farmall was never a cattle-driving tool. It was only a clock. The steady sound of the engine always let the cattle know where the pressure was. They would avoid that pressure on their own. But the direction they chose was what mattered. Samuel had spent years understanding this land. He knew the morning wind at the end of August always blew from southwest to northeast. He knew the cottonwood row to the west created a shade nearly 3 degrees cooler than the middle of the field. He knew the small creek behind the trees still held the greenest clover patches even when late summer began to dry. And more important than anything, he knew when cattle were frightened, they always looked for a place cooler, softer, and quieter. Evelyn was not leading the herd. She was simply removing every dangerous direction one by one. When a group of cattle started toward the highway, the Farmall slowly appeared at the edge of the road. The herd changed direction. When a few turned back into the middle of the corn, Evelyn only shifted the tractor a few more meters. The herd changed direction again. No whip, no rope, not a single animal was forced. They simply chose the path that felt most comfortable. The crowd began to notice the strangeness. Why are they going by themselves? Nobody's chasing them. Even the sheriff lowered his radio. He had never seen anything like it. The lead bull stepped into the grass corridor on the west. The smell of clover rode the wind. Ahead was the shade of the cottonwoods. Farther on was the old pasture near the creek. No roaring engines, no people shouting, only the steady sound of the Farmall behind. The lead bull kept walking. The second followed, then the third. In less than a minute, all 50 cattle formed a long line. No longer running, they began to walk. Calvin stood frozen. Every plan he had made in the past half hour had failed, while the woman he had just mocked never touched a single animal. The cattle finished the grass corridor and moved into the wide pasture behind the trees. Surrounding the grass was a stone fence Samuel and Evelyn had built by hand more than 30 years earlier. Local limestone blocks stacked in the old style still stood firm after dozens of winters. The moment the last bull stepped through the gate, Evelyn eased off the throttle. The Farmall slowly stopped. She climbed down, walked to the wooden gate, gently pulled it shut. The sound of the iron latch settling into the lock was very soft, but in that moment the entire field fell completely silent. No more running cattle, no more shouting people, no more ATV engines. Only the wind sliding through the trampled corn rows. A young man in the crowd murmured, "That's all it took?" Hank Porter smiled. Samuel used to say, "If you want to bring the herd home, don't make them run. Let them find the way themselves." Calvin looked at the gate that had just closed, then at the old dust-covered Farmall. He began to understand why Samuel had never replaced it with a more modern tractor, not because he couldn't afford one, but because the Farmall always ran at exactly the speed Samuel needed to carry out his method. For years, Calvin thought he understood everything about livestock, but in just a few minutes, everything he believed had collapsed. He walked slowly toward Evelyn. For the first time since taking over his father's farm. For the first time since becoming the richest man in the area. He took off his cowboy hat, bowed slightly before the widow he had tried every way to force into selling her land. And before he spoke, Calvin Walker understood that the hardest thing he had to do that day was not saving 50 bulls, but admitting he had been wrong. That afternoon, after the 50 bulls had been returned to the pasture, Evelyn's cornfield looked as if a tornado had just passed through. Strips of trampled corn stretched from the north fence all the way to the creek on the west. There were stretches of ground dozens of yards wide left with only broken stalks and green leaves mixed into the mud. Insurance company people County extension agents and cooperative representatives arrived one after another to inspect. After hours of measuring, they agreed on one conclusion: the damage could exceed 50% of the yield. For a farm that lived on a single corn crop each year, that figure almost meant losing an entire year's income. Calvin Walker stood in the middle of the field, looking at the flattened corn rows without the sense of victory he had felt that morning. For the first time in many years, he did not dare meet the eyes of the neighbors standing around him. Every glance made him remember the triumphant smile when the cattle first poured through the fence. News spread across Republic County in a single day. No one talked anymore about Evelyn having to sell the farm. They only talked about the richest man in the area who had let his own bulls destroy a widow's field. The first night after the incident, Calvin barely slept. He kept replaying the moment Evelyn calmly drove the old farmall along the edge of the field, while everyone else, including him, ran in desperation. The second night was the same. By the third night, he stepped out onto the porch near 2 in the morning, looked toward the dark fields in the distance, and for the first time asked himself whether for years he had been mistaken about something. He had thought he understood farming better than anyone in the area. But in a single morning, that belief had been shattered by a woman who owned not a single piece of modern machinery. The next morning, Calvin went to see Evelyn on his own. "I'll cover the entire loss," he said it briefly. "I'll pay for everything." Evelyn bent down, picked up a corn stalk that had been pressed sideways, brushed the dirt still clinging to the leaves, and shook her head. "Not yet." Calvin was surprised. "Don't you need the money? Wait until harvest." She looked out at the field. "The corn always tells the real story at the end of the season, not on the day it gets trampled." No one understood that sentence. Even the insurance adjuster thought Evelyn was only trying to stay calm in the face of irreversible damage. The following weeks passed in waiting. September arrived, then early October. The corn stalks that had only been pressed into the ground but not broken began to straighten again after days of sun. The root systems kept drawing water. The ears kept growing, even though the stalks carried deep bruises. The whole field gradually turned the gold of harvest time. On the day the combines started working, the result surprised everyone. The yield was down, but far less than the original prediction. The extension agent rechecked every figure and slowly closed his notebook. "I was wrong." He looked at Evelyn and said in front of everyone, "We only evaluated what we could see on the surface. We saw the stalks pressed down, but no one checked the roots." The insurance representative nodded too. "If you only looked at the field that day, anyone would have concluded the crop was lost. But the roots were still alive, and that is what saved the whole field." Calvin said nothing. He walked out into the middle of the rows, bent down before a corn stalk that the cattle had once pressed flat against the ground. Now it stood upright again, the old break still visible on the stem, but the ear above it fully ripe and golden. Calvin touched the stalk lightly. His voice was barely loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "I thought they were dead." Evelyn looked across the field and smiled. "Same as people, some things look as if they've gone down for good. But their roots are still there." A long silence settled. No one spoke. The combine kept running steadily in the distance. Only then did Calvin truly understand what Evelyn had seen from the very first day. She had never denied the damage. She simply understood that damage does not always mean loss. A week later, Calvin brought to Evelyn's farm a check made out for the full amount of compensation. He laid it on the old wooden table in the kitchen. "I still owe you." Evelyn looked at the check and gently pushed it back. "I don't need this money." "What do you want?" Evelyn stepped out onto the porch. She pointed toward the boundary line between the two farms. The old stretch of fence still lay scattered after the incident. "If you really want to make it right, help me rebuild the entire fence." Calvin nodded. But when the work began, he realized Evelyn did not simply want a new fence put up. The two of them replaced every wooden post, stretched every strand of wire, reset every foundation stone. It was no longer the repair of a structure. It was the process of closing years of suspicion, rivalry, and confrontation between two neighboring farms. On the day the last post was driven, Calvin stood a long time looking at the new fence line stretching to the far end of the field. Before, he had always seen that boundary as the thing keeping him from the missing piece of land. Now he looked at it as a reminder that a good neighbor is always worth more than a few extra dozen acres. He turned to Evelyn, his eyes no longer carrying the confidence of a man who once believed money could solve everything. His voice dropped. "For years, I only learned how to buy land. Today, I finally realize I never learned how to understand it." That autumn ended more quietly than anyone in Republic County had expected. People no longer talked much about the 50 bulls or the rows of corn that had been trampled. What drew the whole area's attention was the change in Calvin Walker. The man who had once taken pride in owning the most land in the county began appearing in places he had rarely set foot before. Instead of sitting in an office staring at maps, numbers, and reports from managers, Calvin spent hours walking the pastures right at sunrise. He checked every stretch of fence himself, marked the wooden posts beginning to rot, noted where water pooled after rain, watched the strips of grass that stayed green when the rest had turned yellow. The notebook in Calvin's shirt pocket no longer held only corn prices, feed costs, or livestock counts. In it appeared the wind direction each morning, the softness of the soil after every rain, the time the cattle sought tree shade, and the places they usually avoided when the weather changed. Many hands did not understand why he could stand still for dozens of minutes just watching a herd grazing. Before, Calvin only needed to know where they were. Now he wanted to understand why they chose that spot. One manager once asked, "You could use a plane to check faster." Calvin looked at the distant cattle and answered, "Machines tell me where they are standing, but my own feet help me understand why they want to stand there." By winter, he ordered the old grass corridors that had been filled in for machinery to be opened again. He changed the layout of several pastures, restored natural water points, and required every hand to walk the farm and inspect it at least once a week. After only 1 year, the number of cattle breaking through fences dropped to the lowest level since Calvin took over the place. People around the area began to look at him differently, but Calvin did not take that change as his own achievement. Early the next spring, the Kansas State Agricultural Association invited Evelyn Carter to speak at the annual conference in Manhattan. That day, hundreds of farmers, extension specialists, and university instructors filled the hall. Evelyn stepped onto the stage carrying Samuel's old notebook and his faded work hat. Her talk lasted less than 10 minutes. She used no charts, no projected images, no introduction of any new technology. Evelyn simply told how Samuel often asked her to slow down whenever they went to the field. He believed a field always warned of trouble through the smallest signs: a strip of grass changing color, an unusual wind direction, livestock tracks concentrated where they had never stood before, or a patch of ground holding water longer than usual. He always said the land is never silent, Evelyn told them. Only people become too busy to hear it. As she prepared to finish, Calvin suddenly stood up from a middle row. The whole hall turned toward him. Calvin removed his hat, looked at Evelyn, and spoke in a clear voice. "For years, I thought the people who taught me farming were the equipment salesmen, the financial experts, and the contracts that helped me expand the farm." He paused. "But the most important teacher I ever had is Evelyn Carter." The hall fell silent. Calvin continued, "She did not teach me how to own more land. She taught me to understand that owning a piece of land and truly knowing it are two completely different things." Evelyn did not answer at once. She looked at Samuel's old hat resting on the speaker's table. In that moment, she remembered the mornings he had taken her across the pastures, stopped before a footprint or a bush leaning with the wind, and told her to look more carefully. Samuel had been right from the beginning. The land always speaks, and those patient enough will hear it. Evelyn turned back to the podium, closed the notebook, and said, "The land never betrays anyone. Only people stop listening to the land." No one clapped right away. The professors sat still. The older farmers bowed their heads. Calvin remained standing, hat held against his chest. Then the first applause rose from the back of the hall. Within seconds, everyone was on their feet. Many people once thought Evelyn had defeated Calvin the day 50 bulls poured into the cornfield. Evelyn knew the truth was simpler than that. She had only been patient enough to wait for the land to answer for itself. Years later, people no longer remembered exactly how many rows of corn the herd had ruined, or how many bushels the field had lost. But they still remembered the lesson an elderly widow left for the whole of Kansas. The land always remembers who listened to it. Evelyn Carter died in early spring of 1998 at the age of 86, right in the small wooden house that had looked out over the cornfield for nearly half a century. Word of her passing spread across Republic County in a single morning. Without any call, hundreds of people from the surrounding farms made their way to say goodbye to the widow who years earlier they had thought was only clinging to a piece of land past its time. Her son, Jacob Carter, returned from Colorado a few days after the funeral. He did not sell the farm as many had predicted. He continued farming the same fields his parents had kept for decades. The first thing Jacob did each spring was not check the irrigation system or order seed. He opened the door of the old shed, wiped the dust from the 1959 Farmall 560, changed the engine oil, checked every line, and let the machine idle a few minutes the way his father once had. The Farmall no longer had to do the heaviest work, but it was still maintained carefully as an inseparable part of the farm. Not because of the tractor's value, but because of what it had witnessed. Calvin Walker kept the promise he had made to himself. He never again let anyone laugh at an old tractor, simply because its paint had faded. Nor did he let anyone dismiss the experience of older farmers. Whenever a young engineer or a new farm owner arrived to introduce the latest equipment, Calvin always said the same sentence: "Before you buy a new machine, make sure you already understand the ground under your feet." Not a few people were surprised to hear those words from the man who once believed technology could solve every problem. A few years later, high schools and agricultural colleges across Kansas began bringing students to visit the Carter farm. They wanted to see with their own eyes the field that had become a story told in many classes on pasture management and livestock behavior. Every tour ended at the old shed. The Farmall still stood there, the paint still peeling, the scratches still intact. But what drew the students was not the tractor. It was the story behind it. Calvin was usually the one who told it. He did not begin with the 50 bulls, did not speak of the damage, did not talk about his own wealth. He began with a woman who had spent her whole life observing what most people overlooked. He spoke of patience, of humility, of the ability to watch, and of the farmer's need to learn to understand the land before trying to conquer it. Once a student asked Calvin, "If you could go back to that morning, what is the first thing you would do?" Calvin looked out at the field turning gold under the late autumn sun and smiled. "I would stay quiet longer." That was the answer that made the whole group of students stand still for a few seconds before writing it in their notebooks. Years passed. The new fences still stood firm between the two farms. They did not only keep cattle from wandering, they also marked the place where years of confrontation had ended in respect. People no longer remembered exactly how many rows of corn the 50 bulls had destroyed, nor how many acres Calvin had once owned. But they still remembered that on one morning at the end of August, an elderly widow had saved an entire herd without ever chasing them. And from that day, an entire countryside learned again how to look at the ground under its feet, because some fields grow corn. But the fields worth remembering grow people who understand that quiet knowledge always outlasts loud confidence. If you enjoyed this story and believe timeless wisdom still has a place in today's world, please subscribe to the channel and join us for more frontier stories inspired by resilience, practical knowledge, and the lessons history still has to teach. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care, and never stop listening to the land beneath your feet.